Get your filthy hands off the courthouse steps. You don't belong here. Thug. Those words, shouted loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, were hurled with such hatred they cut deeper than the slap that followed. The officer's open palm cracked across Judge Elijah Thompson's face, a blow so sharp it split his lip, the taste of iron flooding his mouth as his briefcase crashed to the ground, scattering important case files like fallen leaves across the stone steps of the Richard J. Daley Center. The scene looked almost theatrical, but there was nothing staged about the humiliation. Elijah had walked those very steps for decades, head held high, often greeted with respect and nods from clerks, attorneys, and citizens alike. Yet this morning, dressed in his simple gray suit without the robe that marked his authority, he was reduced in the eyes of Officer Diego Ramirez to nothing more than a stereotype, a faceless man of color to be mocked, manhandled, and dismissed. Ramirez leaned close, sneering, his breath laced with contempt as he barked. Men like you should be in a cell, not pretending you have business in this building. He shoved Elijah hard against the wall, the steel of the handcuffs biting into wrists that had signed thousands of orders, freed the innocent, and sentenced the guilty. Elijah stood still, absorbing the sting, refusing to give Ramirez the satisfaction of seeing him break. But inside he was shaken, not by the violence itself. He had seen worse, but by the bitter realization that in an instant, all the years of dignity, service, and honor could be stripped away when someone chose to see him only as his skin. The moment carried him back to another day, half a century earlier, Southside Chicago, 1975. He was just 8 years old, walking beside his father, Samuel Thompson, a steelworker with calloused hands and a proud back. They were on their way home when 2 white officers pulled up, accusing his father of loitering, of fitting the description of someone who had robbed a store. Elijah remembered the confusion, the fear, the sound of fists striking flesh as they beat his father to the ground, his cries mixing with the shouts of the officers. That image never left him. It lived inside him like a scar, pushing him toward the law, pushing him to Yale, pushing him to become a prosecutor, and eventually a judge. His father had told him afterward, blood still on his face, "Justice doesn't come. Son, you bring it." Those words had become Elijah's creed, and now, decades later, cuffed on the very steps where he had fought to bring justice, he felt the cruel echo of history repeating itself. Around him, the cruelty continued. Officers Gonzalez and Hayes circled like hyenas, one pulling out his phone to record, laughing as if Elijah's suffering was entertainment, the other taunting, "Smile for the camera, judge of the streets." Their laughter cut deeper than the slap, because it carried the weight of a system that rewarded mockery, a system where the humiliation of a black man was still a casual spectacle. Passers-by slowed, some shocked, some curious, but none willing to intervene. The crowd became part of the abuse, a silent jury that did nothing to stop the injustice unfolding before them. Ramirez's voice rose again, dripping with contempt. Another project rat trying to sneak into a place he doesn't belong. His words were a dagger, not just to Elijah, but to every person of color who had ever been told they didn't belong, no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they achieved. Elijah stayed silent, but not out of weakness. His silence was deliberate, a choice carved from years on the bench where he had learned that words carry weight, and timing is everything. He knew he could not win by shouting back. He would win by enduring, by letting the truth surface, by remembering his father's wisdom, yet inside, the battle was fierce. Doubt whispered in his mind, asking if the years he had spent fighting for justice had meant anything at all. If the system he had defended was rotten beyond repair. Could justice truly be blind when the color of his skin made him invisible without his robe? Ramirez pressed the radio to his mouth. Calling in his sergeant, Got a suspicious intruder. Resisting. We're handling it. The reply came cold and calculated. Sergeant Victor Vargas's voice crackling through the static. Handle it quietly. Keep the story straight. Vargas was the kind of man who built his career by protecting the Brotherhood, burying complaints, silencing victims, keeping officers like Ramirez safe from accountability. To him, Elijah was just another problem to be managed, another file to bury. Elijah knew Vargas's name. He had seen it linked to reports that mysteriously vanished, to cases that were dismissed for lack of evidence. This was no accident. This was a machine at work, a system designed to crush truth, dragged across the courthouse threshold. Elijah stumbled, but held his head high. Every step was a cruel reminder that respect could be as fragile as paper, torn apart by prejudice in an instant. The same doors that had opened for him every morning now became bars of a cage. The clank of the handcuffs was deafening, the scrape of his shoes on marble a soundtrack of humiliation. He caught sight of the brass plaque near the entrance, his own name engraved for all to see. The Honorable Judge Elijah Thompson presiding. But none of the officers noticed. Or perhaps they didn't care. Stripped of the robe, he was just another black man to them. His lip bled onto his collar, a stain of both injury and insult. And still the officers laughed. Gonzalez muttered, "Let's add resisting arrest. Make sure this sticks." Hayes smirked. "Yeah, nobody's going to believe him anyway." Their confidence was chilling, born not of strength but of a system that had always protected them. Ramirez's record told the story. 52 complaints in 18 years, 85% involving people of color. Yet he wore the badge as if it were armor against consequence. Chicago had paid out millions in settlements tied to his abuse. But still, he stood here, free to slap, to sneer, to cage another man, to cage a judge. Elijah's thoughts raced. He thought of the people who had stood in his courtroom, pleading for mercy, insisting they had been framed, insisting the police had lied. How many times had he wondered privately if they were telling the truth? How many times had he ruled by the book, trusting a system that was now grinding him beneath its boots? Shame flickered in his chest, mingled with anger. But then another feeling rose, steady and fierce, resolve. This was not the end of his story. This was the beginning of a reckoning. As Ramirez pushed him down the hallway, whispering threats, Elijah caught the officer's words. "You'll never see a judge's bench. Not from where you're going." That was meant to crush him. Instead, it steeled him. He knew Ramirez was wrong. He knew this day, though drenched in humiliation, would not end with him silenced. It would end with the gavel in his hand, the truth exposed, and the system itself on trial. Under the harsh glare of the courtroom lights, Judge Elijah Thompson sat in silence, hands still bound, as if he were an ordinary defendant instead of the man who had once presided over these very halls. And across from him stood Officer Diego Ramirez, his uniform pressed, his voice steady, delivering lies as though they were gospel, declaring to Judge Whitaker that Elijah had been loitering near the courthouse, acting suspicious, carrying forged documents, and when approached had resisted arrest with aggression, a story so carefully constructed it might have convinced anyone who didn't know better. For Ramirez spoke with the arrogance of a man who had rehearsed this routine many times before, and behind him stood Officers Gonzalez and Hayes nodding in agreement, their faces smug, their words dripping with false confidence as they swore Elijah had lunged, cursed, even attempted to strike them. Each detail piling higher like bricks in a wall meant to bury him alive. Prosecutor Emily Hayes, young but ambitious, leaned forward at the prosecution table, echoing their claims, urging the court to move swiftly with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on an officer. Her voice firm, almost impatient, as if she saw no reason to question the account of 3 decorated policemen against the word of a man in cuffs. Yet amidst the rhythm of lies, there was one person whose heartbeat quickened with unease. Clerk Aisha Patel, seated quietly near the corner of the room, her fingers poised above her keyboard as she transcribed every false word. But her mind racing back to earlier cases, moments when she had heard this same deep, commanding voice, Elijah's voice, delivering verdicts, guiding proceedings, a voice that spoke not like a criminal, but like a man of wisdom and authority. And in that moment, recognition pierced through her doubt. She realized with a jolt that this was not some intruder at all, but Judge Thompson himself, stripped of his robe, yet not of his dignity. Aisha's pulse raced as her thoughts shifted to her own family's history, to her brother who had been wrongfully arrested in the fearful aftermath of 9/11, detained for days without charges, released only after their parents drained savings to hire an attorney, a wound that never healed, a wound that taught her the price of silence. And now, watching Ramirez weave lies that would send an innocent man into ruin, she felt the same injustice burning in her chest, and she knew she could not stay quiet. Not again. Ramirez carried himself like a man untouchable. Recounting Elijah's supposed crimes with such ease, it revealed years of practice, years of turning truth into fiction. And Sergeant Victor Vargas sat in the gallery, arms folded, his sharp eyes fixed on both Ramirez and Aisha, sending a silent warning. Keep the story straight. No mistakes, no hesitation, and above all, no evidence left behind. Elijah sat still, his gaze steady, lips pressed together, blood still dried on his collar. And though he did not speak yet, his eyes burned with a knowledge far deeper than Ramirez could imagine. The eyes of a man who had heard every kind of lie from every kind of mouth, who knew the sound of fear disguised as authority. The tension grew as Prosecutor Hayes lifted her file, reciting statistics about crime near the courthouse, insisting Elijah match the profile of known agitators from the projects. And the words stung, not because they held truth, but because they echoed decades of prejudice. The same prejudice that had turned Elijah into a suspect the moment Ramirez saw his skin. The gallery shifted uneasily, whispers floating, some nodding with belief, others frowning with doubt. But Aisha, fingers trembling, sent a quiet text to Chief Judge Elizabeth Carter, her message brief yet urgent. Judge Thompson under arrest. False charges. Need oversight immediately. She glanced up and caught Vargas's glare, cold and heavy, and for a fleeting moment fear washed over her. Fear of losing her job, of retaliation, of harm to her family. But the memory of her brother's tears hardened her resolve. She would not let fear dictate silence this time, as the officers droned on. Elijah allowed himself a quiet whisper, just loud enough to be caught by those near him. A whisper of legal truth. Sixth Amendment. Right to counsel. Right to confront witnesses. His words carrying like a seed planted in the room, stirring unease among a few in the gallery. A reminder that the man in cuffs knew the law better than those accusing him. And Ramirez, hearing the whisper, stiffened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. For deep down, he knew lies could only hold as long as no evidence surfaced. Elijah's silence had been calculated, but his whispers now were sharper than any outburst, reminders that he was not broken, not defeated. Gonzalez stepped forward, embellishing the tale, swearing Elijah had swung at him, claiming a bruise would appear later. His words rehearsed but hollow, and Hayes chimed in, insisting she saw Elijah reaching for his briefcase as if for a weapon, each statement stacking like cards in a house that swayed ever so slightly as the truth pressed against it. Aisha's eyes flicked to the monitors in the clerk's office across the hall, monitors linked to courthouse surveillance, and she knew the truth lived there, untainted, preserved. She rose quietly during a recess, slipping into the hallway, her heart pounding as she logged into the system, fingers flying over keys, searching the feed from 8:45 to 9:15 that morning, the exact window Elijah had entered. And there it was, the footage of Ramirez striking first, the slap, the insult, the handcuffs, the laughter, all captured with brutal clarity. Her throat tightened, but before she could secure the file, Vargas appeared in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor, his voice low and menacing. "Whatever you think you saw, forget it, Patel. Your family doesn't need this trouble." Her hands trembled, but she pressed download, saving the file to the cloud, her breath shallow, her pulse quickening. Back in the courtroom, Vargas leaned toward Ramirez, signaling him with a subtle nod, reminding him to stay composed, to bury doubt under performance. But Elijah's gaze never wavered, his silence now glowing with power, the power of patience, of knowing truth would emerge. The statistics haunted the air. Ramirez's record of 1,200 arrests, 85% Black or Latino in a city where those groups made up only 32% of the population. A disparity so glaring it screamed prejudice. Yet he stood unfazed, shielded by a system that had always chosen loyalty to the badge over loyalty to the truth. Aisha returned to her seat, her eyes meeting Elijah's for the first time. And in that look, a silent pact was made. She had the evidence. He had the strength. Together, they would bring this charade to an end. The session continued, Ramirez pounding his lies into the record, Hayes echoing them with cold precision. But the balance of power had already shifted, unseen by most in the room, carried quietly in Aisha's pocket, ready to change the course of everything. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, whispering again, words only he could hear. "Justice doesn't come. Son, you bring it." And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the reckoning was only beginning. The moment the hearing resumed, Elijah Thompson's voice finally broke the silence. Calm, yet steady, carrying the authority of a man who had lived his entire life inside these walls. "Your Honor, under the Sixth Amendment, I demand the preservation and presentation of all surveillance footage between 8:45 and 9:15 this morning, pursuant to Brady v. Maryland, which requires exculpatory evidence be made available to the defense, and though his words came from the seat of a defendant. They struck the courtroom with the weight of a seasoned judge, sending ripples through the gallery, while Ramirez stiffened, his jaw tightening as though he sensed the ground shifting beneath him. Judge Whitaker, perched uneasily on the bench, frowned, glancing at the prosecutor, who shuffled papers nervously, while Ramirez spoke quickly. The cameras malfunctioned. "Judge, technical issue. Nothing to see there." His tone clipped, rehearsed, a man used to having his word taken as fact. But before Whitaker could respond, Clerk Aisha Patel, her hands trembling yet determined, slid a tablet discreetly across the defense table toward Elijah, her eyes locking with his in a silent plea for courage. He tapped the screen, and there it was. The raw footage pulled from the courthouse cloud, showing Ramirez striking first, the slap echoing, the words dripping with venom. "You don't belong here." Thug, followed by the metallic clank of handcuffs and the laughter of Gonzalez and Hayes. The room seemed to freeze, the truth exposed in pixels, undeniable, unspinnable, preserved in the very system Ramirez had tried to erase. Elijah lifted the tablet high, turning it so the gallery could see, his lip still bleeding but his voice rising with clarity. "This is what justice looks like when those sworn to protect it choose instead to corrupt it." Gasps broke from the crowd. Reporters scribbled, phones lifted to record, and Ramirez's smug mask faltered, sweat breaking across his forehead as he stammered. That could be doctored. That's not official." But before his protest could gain momentum, Aisha rose from her seat, her voice shaking yet resolute. "This file is time-stamped, cloud-backed, and directly pulled from the court's own security system, Sergeant Vargas attempted to interfere. But I secured it before it was destroyed. Her words landed like a hammer, turning every head in the room, including Vargas's, who sat rigid in the gallery, his eyes dark with fury, his plan unraveling in front of everyone. Elijah seized the moment, his voice steady, commanding, though his body still bore the marks of abuse. I request the immediate preservation of all footage, including body cameras and courthouse security, before further tampering occurs. Whitaker hesitated, glancing nervously toward Vargas, who shifted uncomfortably, then toward Ramirez, who looked ready to explode, but the silence in the room was thick with expectation, the gallery leaning forward, watching history bend. Vargas, sensing control slipping, leaned close to Aisha as she stepped into the hallway to fetch a file, his whisper sharp, threatening. "Stay quiet. Patel, or your family's in trouble. Accidents happen." She froze, fear rippling through her veins. But she pressed record on her phone, capturing every chilling word, her courage outweighing her terror, returning to the courtroom. She slipped the device onto the evidence table, pressing play, and the audio filled the chamber. Vargas's voice echoing, undeniable, "Stay quiet, or your family's in trouble." The sound struck like a thunderclap, the gallery erupting in gasps, Judge Whitaker's face pale, Ramirez's eyes wide with panic, and Elijah's expression calm but burning with vindication. He leaned forward, his voice low but cutting through the chaos. "This is the system I have sworn to uphold, and this is the rot that has poisoned it from within." Ramirez shifted in his seat, his confidence shattered, sweat dripping down his temple as he muttered, "This isn't fair. You don't know what it's like. You weren't there in 2009, you didn't take a bullet, you didn't lose everything." His voice cracked, a flash of the bitterness that had shaped his hatred, the trauma of that shooting seeping through. But Elijah did not waver. Trauma may explain pain, Officer Ramirez, but it does not excuse 18 years of cruelty, lies, and abuse, he said firmly, his voice carrying the steadiness of truth. He turned toward the gallery, speaking not just to the court, but to the city, to the nation watching through phones and cameras now streaming live. This is not one man's grudge. This is a pattern, a legacy of violence cloaked in the uniform of law, and it will end today, for a moment. Silence blanketed the room, the weight of his words heavy, undeniable, as every face turned to him, no longer seeing a defendant in cuffs, but the judge they had always known, the man who carried justice in his voice. Whitaker's gavel struck weakly, attempting to restore order, but even she seemed shaken, caught between the power of the badge and the undeniable truth on the screen. Aisha, her hands still trembling, stepped forward once more, whispering to Elijah, "There's more. There are other files, weeks of them, showing patterns of harassment, erasures, cover-ups." Elijah nodded, the fire in his eyes steady, and though the cuffs still held his wrists, his presence filled the room with authority. He demanded on the record, all surveillance and body cam footage from the last 30 days must be preserved under penalty of obstruction. Any attempt to destroy them is itself a crime. Vargas finally stood, his face tight, his voice booming in protest. "This man is no judge. He's a liar, a fraud trying to dismantle the department. Don't let him fool you." But the evidence had already spoken. The video on the tablet, the audio from the phone, the statistics of Ramirez's record, the lived truth etched in Elijah's face, and the gallery's eyes turned cold against the officers, the tide shifting in real time. Elijah sat back, exhausted but unbroken, the memory of his father flashing again in his mind, the blood on the street in 1975, the whispered words, "Justice doesn't come. You bring it." And now, here he was, bringing it in the very heart of the courthouse, against the very men who thought they could bury him. The weight of history pressed down, but so too did the possibility of change. The people in that room were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses to a turning point, a reckoning long overdue. And though the fight was far from over, though Vargas would scheme and Ramirez would resist, Elijah knew in that moment the truth was out, and once revealed, truth could never be caged again. The bailiff returned carrying a black garment bag, and when he unzipped it, the room seemed to hold its breath, for inside lay the robes that marked Elijah Thompson's true station, the fabric that carried not just authority, but decades of sacrifice and service. And as Elijah rose, the chains of the handcuffs clinking at his side, the gallery leaned forward, sensing something extraordinary was about to unfold, the quiet tension breaking when the bailiff declared with a firm voice, "Your Honor, these belong to you," handing the robe over with a reverence that silenced even the most cynical onlookers. And in that moment, Judge Whitaker, his face pale and shaken, stepped down from the bench, nodding almost instinctively as though even he recognized the true authority in the room. Elijah slipped his arms into the robe, the fabric heavy but familiar, each fold a reminder of the countless verdicts he had rendered, the families he had comforted, the criminals he had sentenced, and the innocent he had freed. The weight of the robe was the weight of justice itself, and as he fastened the clasp at his throat and stood tall, the transformation was complete. No longer a man in cuffs, no longer a victim of humiliation, but the judge who had walked those halls for 28 years. He moved with quiet dignity toward the bench, each step echoing against the marble floor. And when he took the seat of power, the room erupted into murmurs, some gasping, some applauding, others stunned into silence, but all knowing they were witnessing something that would be retold for generations. Elijah lifted the gavel that Whitaker had left behind, the gavel engraved with the words, "Justice sees all," and when he struck it once, the crack resounded like thunder, cutting through the noise, restoring order not with fear, but with authority earned through decades of service. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice steady, commanding, unshakable, and the gallery erupted into applause before quieting again under his raised hand. Across the room, Ramirez's confidence collapsed, his shoulders hunched, his face pale, sweat dripping as he muttered, "This is a trick. This isn't real. He's not the judge." But the evidence already betrayed him, the video still glowing on the tablet, the audio still replaying Vargas's threats, and the robe now wrapped around the very man he had called a thug. Elijah turned his gaze toward Ramirez, his eyes unflinching, and said, "You thought me powerless, but I hold the gavel, and with it comes the full weight of the law." The words struck harder than any slap, and Ramirez, once the predator, now looked like prey, shifting nervously, his hands twitching as though searching for escape. Elijah ordered the footage to be displayed on the courtroom screens, and the gallery winced as they watched the slap, the insult, the laughter, their faces registering horror and disbelief, while Ramirez buried his face in his hands. Gonzalez and Hayes, standing nearby, tried to keep their composure, but their eyes darted nervously, betraying the fear of men who knew their lies were unraveling. Sergeant Vargas was called to the stand, and though he tried to cloak himself in authority, his voice faltered under Elijah's questioning. "Did you or did you not instruct Officer Patel to remain silent?" Elijah pressed, his tone sharp, his gavel striking when Vargas attempted to evade. "Answer truthfully," Elijah commanded. And for the first time, Vargas looked small, stripped of the power that came from intimidation, his words stumbling. I only meant to protect her. The situation was dangerous." Elijah leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "No, Sergeant, You meant to protect yourself, and in doing so you attempted to silence the truth, a truth this court will not bury. As the cross-examination continued, Elijah allowed his mind a brief flashback, a memory of Ramirez as a young officer, years earlier, arriving in court with the same smugness, testifying against a black teenager Elijah suspected had been framed. And now, in hindsight, he understood that the rot had been there all along, protected by men like Vargas, covered by lies, perpetuated by silence. He knew that exposing this case meant exposing not just one officer, but an entire culture of abuse that had gone unchecked for decades. He turned to the statistics laid before him, numbers that had haunted him for years. Ramirez using force in 65% of his arrests involving people of color, compared to just 10% with white suspects. A disparity so grotesque it revealed intent, not coincidence. Elijah read the numbers aloud, his voice carrying the weight of every victim buried under them. These are not just numbers. These are lives. Maria Lopez beaten in her own kitchen, Jamal Carter framed with drugs, Dr. Samuel Green shackled on false pretenses, all victims of the man who now trembles before this court. The gallery erupted, some shouting in anger, some in tears, the stories hitting too close to home, each name a reminder of how far corruption had spread. Elijah turned his attention back to Ramirez, who now sat shaking, his once firm voice reduced to a whisper. I only did what I thought was right. I kept the city safe. But Elijah's response was unflinching. Safety built on lies is not safety at all. It is tyranny. He lifted the gavel once more, slamming it down with force, the sound reverberating through the chamber. Justice will not bow to fear. It will not bow to prejudice, and it will not bow to you. In that instant, the roles had reversed entirely. Ramirez and Vargas, once cloaked in authority, were stripped bare, while Elijah, once humiliated and bloodied, stood taller than ever, not because of vengeance, but because of justice. The gallery rose to its feet, applause filling the air, phones lifted to capture history, the images already streaming across the nation, the story already spreading faster than the officers could contain it, yet amidst the thunderous applause. Elijah felt a quiet war within himself, the old struggle between mercy and judgment. He had seen remorse in men before, had seen criminals break down and beg for forgiveness, and sometimes he had granted it. But as he looked into Ramirez's eyes hardened by years of cruelty, he saw no true regret, only fear of consequence, and he knew mercy here would not heal the wounds. It would only deepen them. His father's voice echoed once more in his memory. Justice doesn't come. Son, you bring it. And Elijah understood that this moment was not about his pride, not about revenge for the slap on the courthouse steps, but about every victim who had never been given a voice, every family who had been silenced, every statistic that represented a life ruined by prejudice. He leaned forward, his voice low but powerful. You wanted me in chains, Officer Ramirez, but today it is your lies that are shackled, your prejudice that stands trial, and this court will not rest until the truth is free. The courtroom fell silent again, not out of fear, but out of awe. The kind of silence that comes when people recognize they are witnessing history. Even Whitaker, standing to the side, bowed his head, acknowledging the shift, acknowledging that the gavel now rested in the hands of its rightful owner. Aisha Patel, tears in her eyes, sat straighter, knowing her courage had mattered, that her choice to defy fear had helped tip the scales. And Elijah, though his lips still bled and his body still ached, felt a strength he had not felt in years, the strength of a man not just surviving injustice but overcoming it, not just fighting for himself but for all who had been denied justice. As he lifted the gavel again and declared, "This court will continue with the truth, and only the truth." The people knew the tide had turned. that the reckoning was not only inevitable but already here. The courtroom air was thick with anticipation as Judge Elijah Thompson adjusted his robe, the fabric heavy on his shoulders yet lighter than the burden he carried for decades. And with a steady hand, he lifted a thick file, the compilation of every complaint, every grievance, every voice that had been silenced under the shadow of Officer Diego Ramirez's badge. And as he opened the file, the names poured out like a river of pain. Maria Lopez, a grandmother shoved to the ground and beaten during a traffic stop. Jamal Carter, a high school student framed with drugs that were planted in his backpack. Dr. Samuel Green, a respected physician handcuffed in front of his children for a crime he never committed. And Elijah read each story aloud, his voice carrying the anguish of those whose cries had been ignored, each name striking the gallery like a hammer, each detail tearing at the mask Ramirez had worn for so long. Reporters scribbled frantically. Cameras captured every word, and the gallery leaned in as though absorbing the weight of justice finally spoken. Chief Judge Elizabeth Carter entered the room quietly, her stern presence commanding respect. And when Elijah acknowledged her, she confirmed what many suspected, that the FBI had been investigating Ramirez for months, documenting not only his 52 complaints, but the systemic cover-ups orchestrated by Sergeant Vargas. The room erupted, whispers turning into shouts, reporters rushing toward the doors to broadcast the revelation, while Vargas's face drained of color, his lips pressed into a thin line as he realized the brotherhood he thought would shield him had already crumbled. Elijah continued, his tone sharp as steel. Chicago has paid $3.5 million in settlements linked to this man alone, money that could have gone to schools, to hospitals, to communities in need. But instead it paid for silence. It paid to bury truth. He held up Ramirez's record, page after page of dismissed cases, hundreds of arrests thrown out due to constitutional violations, 450 dismissals in total, each one a scar on the system, each one a reminder of justice denied. The gallery gasped, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others with tears in their eyes, for these were not statistics, they were lives, and Elijah gave them voice. Then came the twist that broke whatever defenses Ramirez still clung to. Aisha Patel, her hands still trembling but her courage unshaken, produced a transcript of intercepted text messages, one of which Ramirez had foolishly sent in desperation that morning. A message offering Elijah a bribe if he would drop any potential charges. A message that read, "Name your price. Just don't destroy me." The courtroom buzzed with outrage, voices rising, the evidence undeniable. Vargas, sweating now, stood abruptly, his voice desperate. I covered for him to protect the department, to protect the family. He saved my life in 2009 when I was pinned down. He pulled me out. I owed him everything. And for a brief moment his tone cracked, revealing the twisted loyalty that had fueled years of cover-ups. But Elijah's response was cold, unflinching. Loyalty to corruption is not honor. Sergeant, it is complicity, and the lives destroyed under your watch cry louder than your excuses. The gallery roared with approval, some standing to clap, others shouting justice, as the weight of years of pain found release in one man's words. Ramirez, his body shaking, broke down at last, his face in his hands as tears streamed down, sobbing. I was just doing my job. I thought I was protecting the city. I didn't know how to stop. But Elijah, his jaw tight, his voice unyielding, answered, "Your job was to protect, not destroy, to serve, not to target. And your tears now do not wash away 18 years of blood and lies." His words were final, cutting, leaving no room for redemption in that moment. Prosecutor Emily Hayes, who had moments earlier stood shoulder to shoulder with Ramirez's lies, lowered her head, shame overtaking her, realizing she had been complicit, realizing she had trusted the wrong voices, and her silence now was as much an admission of guilt as Ramirez's tears. Chief Judge Carter, standing tall, announced that a full federal probe would expand beyond Ramirez and Vargas, reaching into the highest levels of the department, and the gallery erupted again, reporters rushing out to break the story that was already going viral. The numbers climbed on screens held aloft, 5 million views, then 10, then 30, as the live feed spread across the nation, the truth no longer confined to one courtroom but carried into every home, every office, every street corner. Elijah closed the file at last, his voice quieter now but every bit as powerful. Regret is not justice, confession is not atonement, and tears do not erase years of cruelty. Justice requires accountability, and accountability begins today. His words fell heavy, undeniable, and Ramirez collapsed into his chair, broken, while Vargas slumped, his face pale, his eyes hollow, knowing the empire of silence he had built was crumbling to dust. The gallery chanted Elijah's name. Thompson, Thompson, their voices rising like a hymn. And for the first time in decades, Elijah allowed himself a small breath of relief. Not for himself, but for his father. For the memory of that beating in 1975. For the promise he had made as a boy to bring justice where it had once been denied. In that moment, he felt his father's hand on his shoulder. Unseen, but present. Whispering again, "Justice doesn't come. Son, you bring it." And Elijah knew he had brought it. Not just for himself, but for a city. For a nation that needed to see what justice looked like when truth was finally set free. The gavel felt heavier in Judge Elijah Thompson's hand as he lifted it high, the polished wood catching the light of the courtroom lamps. And when he brought it down, the sound cracked like thunder, silencing the chaos, silencing the murmurs, silencing the lies, and commanding every soul in the chamber to listen. For this was the moment justice would no longer be delayed. "Officer Diego Ramirez," Elijah began, his voice steady, deep, and filled with authority. "You stand before this court guilty of assault, civil rights violations, perjury under oath, and the abuse of your power over 18 long years." And though Ramirez shook his head violently, his lips trembling as he whispered, "No, no, please. I only did what they trained me to do." The words fell flat against the mountain of evidence, against the 52 complaints, the hundreds of dismissed cases, the millions paid in settlements. And Elijah pressed forward. "The oath you swore was to serve and protect, not to humiliate, not to fabricate, not to destroy lives in the name of prejudice." And with a steady hand, he delivered the sentence. "For your crimes, you are hereby sentenced to 28 years in federal prison." The gallery erupted, gasps and cheers colliding, some crying with relief, others shouting justice, while Ramirez collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands, sobbing openly, his uniform no longer a shield but a prison of its own. Elijah turned next to Sergeant Victor Vargas, who tried to steady himself, gripping the table, his face drenched with sweat, his voice cracking as he pleaded. "I only protected him because he saved my life. I thought it was loyalty. I thought it was duty." But Elijah's eyes bore into him, unflinching. "You silenced victims. You tampered with evidence. You threatened witnesses. And you turned a blind eye to the truth. And for that, Sergeant, you are guilty of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and witness intimidation." And when the gavel came down again, the sound shook the room. "You are sentenced to 12 years in federal prison." Vargas's knees buckled, and he had to be held upright by marshals, his head hanging as the gallery erupted once more. Relief and rage mixing as victims' families wept openly, knowing at last their pain had been acknowledged. Elijah's voice rose again, sweeping across the room. As for Officers Gonzalez and Hayes, who stood by and reinforced false testimony, "You are hereby dismissed from service, stripped of your badges, and referred for prosecution. And the two men slumped back, their faces pale, their smugness gone, realizing the protection they thought would never fail had crumbled in the light of truth. Aisha Patel, seated quietly at the clerk's table, tears running down her cheeks, clutched her phone, knowing the evidence she risked everything to save had shifted the tide. And Elijah, seeing her courage, acknowledged it aloud. This court commends the bravery of Clerk Patel, who chose truth over fear, who stood when silence would have been easier, and because of her, justice lives today. The gallery roared with applause, the sound filling the chamber, reporters scribbling, cameras capturing every second, and already the numbers of views ticked higher on screens. 20 million, 30 million, 60 million, as the live feed of the trial spread like wildfire across the nation. Elijah raised the gavel again, his voice softer now, almost reverent. This gavel is engraved with 3 words: justice sees all. And today those words have proven true, for justice saw beyond uniforms, beyond lies, beyond threats, and it will continue to see all who dare betray the people they swore to serve. His hand shook slightly as he slammed it down, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming weight of the moment. And the gallery responded with a 5-minute standing ovation, people shouting, clapping, some even crying in relief, knowing they had witnessed not just a trial, but a turning point in history. Ramirez tried to rise, stumbling, attempting to protest once more. "I was just doing my job. You don't understand." But Elijah's response was swift and final, his voice cutting through the noise. "Your job was not to destroy lives. Your job was to protect them. And you failed. And for that, justice will follow you all your days." Vargas attempted to lunge for the door, his instincts driving him toward escape, but marshals intercepted him before he reached the gallery, dragging him back in chains, and the sight of the once powerful sergeant struggling like a common criminal brought a hush over the room, a visual confirmation that the system could, at last, hold even its own accountable. Elijah sat back, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his posture still proud. The robe across his shoulders a reminder of the dignity stripped from him hours earlier on the courthouse steps. Now restored and magnified in the eyes of the nation, he reflected inwardly, not on Ramirez or Vargas, but on his father. On that night in 1975 when he saw blood spill onto the street, when he first learned the cruelty of unchecked power, and as the gavel rested in his hand, he felt the presence of his father again, whispering words that had carried him through every trial, every verdict, every moment of doubt. "Justice doesn't come. Son, you bring it." Aisha stepped forward quietly, her voice trembling as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I want to thank you for showing me that truth can still matter, even when it feels impossible." And Elijah, his eyes softening for the first time that day, replied, "No, Ms. Patel, it is you who reminded this court that courage is the seed of justice, and I believe your future will carry that seed farther than you know." Her tears fell freely now, but behind them a new resolve burned. The resolve of a young woman who would no longer remain a clerk in the shadows, but would rise to fight injustice in the light of the law. As marshals led Ramirez and Vargas away, the gallery broke into chants again. Justice, justice, their voices echoing off the walls of the Daily Center, carrying out into the streets, where protesters had already gathered, holding signs with names of victims, signs demanding change, signs celebrating the reckoning that had finally begun. The story, already viral, flooded televisions, radios, and phones across the country, and Elijah knew that what had started as a slap on the courthouse steps had become a symbol that justice could fight back, that dignity could be restored, that truth could not be silenced. He raised the gavel one last time, slamming it down with all the force he had left, his voice ringing out over the ovation. Justice isn't blind. It sees all, and today it has spoken. And in that sound, in that moment, history shifted, forever, 8 months later. The chill of a Chicago spring morning gave way to sunlight spilling across the newly renamed Elijah Thompson Justice Center. The very courthouse where humiliation had once unfolded, now bearing the name of the man who turned disgrace into a legacy. And as Judge Thompson stepped up to the podium, robes flowing, silver hair catching the light, the crowd gathered outside swelled with anticipation. A sea of faces, students, activists, fellow judges, community members, victims' families, each holding signs that read, "Justice sees all and truth cannot be silenced," their chants rolling like thunder down the streets of the city. But today, there was no fear, only pride. Ramirez sat in a federal prison 2 states away, stripped of his badge, his appeals denied, his name forever tied to shame, while Vargas served his 12-year sentence in another facility, his power dismantled, his silence now broken under the weight of testimony he could no longer suppress. And in their absence, Chicago's police department had undergone reforms unseen in generations. Mandatory body cameras streaming to independent servers, civilian oversight boards with true authority, and federal monitors reporting directly to the Department of Justice. The statistics told the story. Police misconduct complaints down 20%. The number of wrongful arrests overturned reaching 50 in the first review alone. $8.9 million paid in restitution to victims who had once been forgotten, and for the first time in decades. Surveys showed the community beginning to trust law enforcement again. Not fully, not blindly, but cautiously, with hope. Elijah spoke into the microphone, his voice steady though thick with emotion. Justice is not blind. My friends, it sees every act, every silence, every victim, and every truth. And though the gavel fell that day against 2 men, the echo was meant for an entire system, a system that will no longer survive on silence. His words rippled across the crowd, carried on live feeds watched by millions, classrooms streaming the speech, churches replaying it on Sunday, the moment already etched into the nation's memory. Behind him stood Aisha Patel, no longer in the modest attire of a clerk, but now wearing the suit of a young attorney, having passed the bar with determination carved from that day in court. And when Elijah gestured to her, the crowd roared, for her name had become synonymous with courage, with refusing to bow to fear. And she raised her hand, smiling through tears, remembering her brother's arrest all those years ago, remembering the fear that once silenced her, now replaced by the fire to speak for others. She had joined the ACLU, spearheading civil rights litigation, already filing cases against misconduct, her future stretching wide before her. And when she leaned into the microphone, her voice carried strong. I stand here because truth mattered, because one man refused to be broken, and because all of you demanded that justice not only be seen but felt. And the crowd erupted, chanting her name alongside Elijah's, proof that legacies are not solitary, but shared. Chief Judge Elizabeth Carter stood nearby, her stern face softened by pride, her arm resting on Elijah's shoulder, affirming the unity of the bench in pursuing reform, while young students in the crowd shouted, "We want to be lawyers. We want to be judges," inspired by what they had seen, proof that even the most entrenched injustice could be shattered. Inside the Justice Center, plaques lined the lobby with the names of victims wronged by Ramirez, a permanent memorial to those who suffered, each name etched in steel so no one would forget. And families stood before them, some weeping, some smiling faintly, but all feeling a measure of closure they thought would never come. Dr. Samuel Green, once falsely arrested, shook Elijah's hand with tears in his eyes, whispering, "You gave me back my dignity," while Jamal Carter, now in college, told reporters, He believed me when no one else did. His words a testament to the ripple effect one moment of courage can create. Across the city, murals of Elijah appeared on brick walls, painted by local artists, showing him in his robe, gavel raised, the words "Justice sees all" emblazoned beneath, transforming neighborhoods that once carried only pain into places of pride, nationally. The impact spread, lawmakers in Washington citing the Thompson case in debates on police reform, the Department of Justice releasing new guidelines on accountability, and even international leaders referencing the story in speeches about human rights. The legacy was no longer confined to Chicago, it was global, a symbol of resilience and truth. Elijah himself felt the weight of it each day, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. And when he returned to Yale to give a lecture, standing in the same halls where he once studied, he shared the memory of his father's beating in 1975, the blood on the sidewalk, the promise he made as a boy, and the way that promise carried him through humiliation, through violence, through silence, into the moment when justice turned its face toward truth. Students rose in standing ovation, some with tears, others with clenched fists of determination, for they understood they were inheriting not just a story but a mission at home. Elijah found peace in ways he never thought possible, walking through South Side streets where once fear had ruled, now greeted with respect and gratitude, children running up to hug him, elders blessing him with words of thanks. And though he was humbled, he always reminded them, this was never about me. It was about all of us. It was about making sure justice finally came home, late at night, alone in his study. He sometimes opened his father's old watch, the one he had carried since that night in 1975, listening to its ticking, a reminder of time lost, of pain endured, and of promises kept. And he would whisper softly, "We did it. Dad, we brought it." And so, as the crowd outside the Justice Center chanted his name, as Aisha stood proudly at his side, as reforms spread like wildfire across the nation, Judge Elijah Thompson smiled, not with pride in himself, but with pride in the people, in the city that had endured so much and still stood, in the victims who were finally seen, in the truth that had finally triumphed. And with his gavel in hand, he ended his speech the same way he ended that trial months earlier, his voice steady, strong, eternal. Justice doesn't just wear a robe, it doesn't just carry a gavel, it doesn't just sit on a bench. Justice lives in every one of us, and it will never again be silenced. The crowd roared, the cameras flashed, and history, once again, bent toward the truth, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire generations to come. Thank you for watching. Tell us where you're from, like the video, and subscribe for more stories of justice.